Red alert in the Kremlin. Russian leader Vladimir Putin's last hope has been destroyed by the Ukrainian army. The train full of Russian troops sent by Vladimir Putin to Ukrainian territory has been neutralized by the Ukrainian army, according to the latest data. More than 300 Russian soldiers are said to have lost their lives while the Russian army's repression on Ukrainian territory continues. The Ukrainian army has been showing great resistance in the city of Bakhmut for months. The Russian army, which managed to capture the city of Soledar, has now directed all its intensity to the Bakhmut front. However, the Russian army has not been able to capture the city of Bakhmut for months, and this has started to disturb Vladimir Putin. Putin, who wanted to increase his offensive in Bakhmut, also wanted to send Russian troops stationed on Ukrainian territory to Bakhmut. Putin wanted to send the troops from the Russian headquarters in the Donetsk region to Bakhmut, prepared a large shipment train. However, this train full of Russian troops was destroyed by unmanned fighter jets sent by the Ukrainian army. Ukrainian state leader Volodymyr Zelensky deployed a large number of Ukrainian soldiers to the Bakhmut front in order not to lose the city of Bakhmut. Thanks to the 17-kilometer defense line that the Ukrainian army has established here, the Russian army is not allowed to pass here. When Valery Gerasimov, the Russian chief of staff, realized that he could not capture the city of Bakhmut with ground attacks, he started to turn to air strikes with Gerasimov order for Russian Su-27 fighter jets set up for the Bakhmut front. Russian pilots entered the Bakhmut airspace without any problems and took action to neutralize the defense line formed by the Ukrainian army. However, the Russian pilots were unaware of the air defense systems deployed behind the Ukrainian defense line. Two of the Russian warplanes approached to fire their missiles at the Ukrainian soldiers. However, at that very moment, one of the Ukrainian soldiers on the defense line targeted the Russian warplane with a portable anti-aircraft missile and fired it. Within seconds, the missile hit the Russian fighter jet and destroyed it after the plane crashed. All the Russian pilots wanted to attack, but they noticed the air defense systems deployed in Bakhmut forced to cancel the airstrike. The Russian pilots returned to the military base in Zaporizhia. This failed operation caused a major controversy in the Kremlin. On the orders of Vladimir Putin and Gerasimov, it was decided to organize a large-scale military deployment to the city of Bakhmut. However, this military operation was prevented by the Ukrainian army before it could reach its target. If we come to the details of the operation, many Russian military headquarters have been established in the Zaporizhia region, which has been under the control of the Russian army for a long time. Military and ammunition shipments are organized to many regions from Zaporizhia, which the Russian army uses as a coordination center. By order of Vladimir Putin, it was decided to send more than 800 Russian soldiers from the Russian headquarters here to the Bakhmut front. Gerasimov, who coordinated the military shipment, decided that this shipment would be made by train. The railroads between Zaporizhia and Donetsk region are one of the most frequently used supply routes of the Russian army. Russian soldiers gathered from many orders were taken to the train station in Natalia region of Zaporizhia. The Russian army, consisting of 12 units, set off for the Donetsk region by train. However, the British intelligence service informed Ukrainian authorities that the Russian army had made a large military deployment to the Donetsk region. Thereupon, Ukrainian and British intelligence jointly determined the route to be followed by the Russian train. Unbeknownst to them, the Russian army moved to reach the Donetsk region. The Ukrainian army mobilized 6 unmanned fighter jets to prevent this train from reaching Donetsk. The unmanned warplanes mobilized from the city of Dnipro and quickly entered the Zaporizhia airspace. Ukrainian unmanned warplanes advanced to the Marianivka region of Zaporizhia and intercepted the Russian delivery train here, descending to launch an airstrike on the train. 6 unmanned warplanes fired their missiles towards the Russian military delivery train. With the firing of the missiles, a huge explosion occurred in the engineer section of the train. 3 of the missiles successfully hit the train wagons and the train derailed. The derailed train overturned within seconds. The Russian soldiers who were surprised tried to get out of the train in order to save their lives. Having successfully completed the operation, Ukrainian unmanned fighter jets returned to the Dnipro military airbase. Shortly after the explosion of the train, Ukrainian state officials made statements with this operation. It is said that more than 250 Russian soldiers lost their lives and nearly 500 Russian soldiers were seriously wounded, while Ukrainian officials confirmed that the operation took place and that many Russian soldiers lost their lives. There was no statement from the Russian government. Recently, the Ukrainian army has stepped up its operations against Russian forces. Russian leader Vladimir Putin is very good at hiding these events in Ukraine from his own people. When the Russian army started to occupy Ukrainian territory, the Russian people took to the streets and protested against Putin and the war, with the Russian army losing nearly 200,000 soldiers on Ukrainian soil. The anger of Russian citizens against Putin has increased considerably. The Russian people are very disturbed by Putin's failure to keep his promises. Before the war started, Vladimir Putin and Russian government officials promised that the occupation of Ukrainian territory would last for a few weeks and that no Russian soldier would even be harmed. However, very soon after the invasion began, the Russian army began to suffer one casualty after another as the Russian army began to suffer losses in Ukraine. The anti-Putin public and Putin's opponents mobilized the Russian opposition, who are uncomfortable with Putin's long-term presidency of Russia, are making great efforts to overthrow Putin's throne, as it is known after the Russian army started to occupy Ukrainian territory. The US and Western countries started to impose embargoes and sanctions against Russia. Due to these sanctions, the Russian economy entered a very turbulent period with the deterioration of the Russian economy. Inflation rates in Russia have also increased dramatically. The Russian people who did not feel the negative effects of the war in the first months of the war started to see the effects of the war with the increase in inflation rates. The Russian people who started to revolt over the rising prices of groceries and technology organized protests in many cities of Russia. Anti-war protests were launched, especially in Moscow and St. Petersburg. One of the things that Putin, who somehow managed to suppress his protests, fears the most right now is the start of a new uprising. Putin, who does not want the losses of the Russian army to be hurt with this latest operation organized by the Ukrainian army, does not allow any explanation about this operation. As it is known, Russia television channels are currently banned from broadcasting any anti-war news. In addition, in case of any news that denigrates the Russian army, the news channel is fined heavily. For this reason, the national channels in Russia do not operate independently. Putin has also managed to take over. The judiciary in Russia is very intimidated by the officials who oppose him. Many Russian dissidents are currently dealing with lawsuits filed by Putin. Previously, some officials who oppose Putin were arrested by Putin. Nevertheless, the Russian people are trying to get information from independent websites to find out what is happening in Ukraine. But Vladimir Putin is making great efforts to prevent this. More than 200,000 websites have been banned in Russia since the beginning of the war. Putin has also banned VPNs to prevent access to these websites, fearing a new uprising. Putin is very afraid that his authority will be shaken. However, according to the statements of independent polling companies in Russia, Vladimir Putin has lost more than 15% of the vote after the war started and is therefore unlikely to win the next elections. There are a lot of updates from the Luhansk region here before the new year. The Ukrainians launched an offensive operation despite the fact that forest battles are slower. the Ukrainians still brought massive results. The advance by more than 2 kilometers. They pushed the Russians from their last defense line, and now both parties are preparing for the final battle in Kreminna. Last time I told you that the Ukrainians assaulted Russian positions north of Dniprovo in the first stage of the operation. The Ukrainians managed to reduce Russian control around Dniprovo significantly, but when the fighting got close to the main base, moving forward became much more difficult as the Russians here had more established positions and better supplies. Besides, the only area under Russian control basically remained the forest, so the Ukrainians could not generate rapid breakthroughs here with their mobile units. That is why the fights became positional, engaging only infantry, artillery, and aviation. The deteriorating weather conditions also played a role. The Ukrainians here waited for the drop in temperature to conduct this offensive operation, but it seems like several days in, the temperature rebounded and there was rain followed by several days of above-zero temperature. Luckily, the Ukrainian offensive did not suffer as much as it could. The reason why the Ukrainian offensive did not fail is that they managed to push the Russians from the fields. So the Ukrainians used the fields while they could gain some ground and secured their positions along the forest. And after that, the forest battle started where the Ukrainians could not use their cars anyway, regardless of whether it was raining or not. Still, as you can imagine, even in the forest, dry weather is preferable for the offensive operation. That is why the offensive operation has inadvertently slowed down but not stopped. During this humid conditions, both the Ukrainians and the Russians started to rely on artillery and aviation more heavily. According to a Russian source, the Ukrainians have around 1,500 servicemen constantly storming Russian positions. According to Military Land, the Ukrainians have deployed the 45th Artillery Brigade to the spot of operation, which is to a large extent focused on the area of the main action Kreminna. Additionally, to provide air support to ground troops, the Ukrainians continue to engage in tactical aircraft Su-27 and MiG-29 from the airfield in northern Ukraine. The Russians seem to have slowly given in to the pressure. Ukrainian Deputy Chief of the Main Operational Directorate reported that Ukrainian forces have advanced 2.5 kilometers in the direction of Kreminna over the past week and are continuing offensive actions towards the settlement. Later, a social media post claimed that Ukrainian forces captured Dniprovo. There was no official confirmation of the Ukrainians entering this village, so the post was disregarded. However, when several days later Russian Ministry of Defense reported about hunting down Ukrainian artillery around Dniprovo, it became obvious that the Russians had left it. This doesn't mean that the Ukrainians have entered it. It looks like it is a gray zone that no party can occupy due to the overwhelming fire. Additionally, a reserve officer and military analyst indirectly confirmed that the Russians left Dniprovo by saying that the Ukrainians are operating less than 5 kilometers away from Kreminna. Other Russian sources are largely indicating that the battle for Kreminna has almost started. A Bar 13 affiliated source claimed that Ukrainian forces are preparing to attack Kreminna from 3 directions. Another Russian source said that they are expecting a Ukrainian counter-offensive operation once the ground freezes in the area, which is forecasted to drop below zero in 2 days and stay below zero for more than a month. Some sources also emphasize that the Ukrainians are even preparing the infrastructure to supply and support the storm troops by erecting additional pontoon crossings southwest of Kreminna. The Russians are trained to adapt to the rapidly worsening situation. The Ukrainian head of the Luhansk region reported that Russian forces are continuing to transfer more equipment and personnel to the Kreminna area, including a substantial number of Wagner Group personnel. However, it seems like they understood that this would not be enough and have reinforced Kreminna with their elite airborne forces. Additionally, the Russian Ministry of Defense claimed that Russian forces relocated here and already started using thermobaric artillery systems, which is a high-value military district-level asset. The fact that the Russians are allocating here the best of what they have means that they are very concerned with losing Crimea. And this is not surprising because they had spent a considerable number of resources in order to erect a formidable defense line around Svardov. But if the Ukrainians take Crimea, then they can simply go around it. Crimea is an incredibly valuable town by establishing control over it. The Ukrainians could attack Svardov, Starobilsk, and Lysychansk. But the most important thing is that the Russian logistics will be completely immobilized. Their rear positions will be compromised and the front line can crumble even until the pre-war line of separation. Ukraine is preparing to thunder over Crimea today. Ukraine is finally getting what it wants on its way to liberating Crimea. Now the roar of the unique tanks and war machines of the Ukrainian army was heard in every street of Crimea. The unique British Challengers, which struck fear into the hearts of the Kremlin and the Russian army, are finally on Ukrainian soil. The war strategy prepared by the Ukrainian forces for the liberation of Crimea consists of two stages. The first stage is the elimination of the land bridge between the Russian mainland and the Crimea. The second stage is to make Crimea vulnerable by weakening the military bases in Crimea. Ukrainian forces occasionally made progress in these two phases. However, an important step was taken for the Crimean offensive the other day. It was expected and the Ukrainian forces got what they wanted. Ukrainian forces have received their much-desired British Challenger 2 tanks. Ukraine Defense Minister Alexei Reznikov shared video footage of the heavy British Challenger 2 tanks arriving in Ukraine on social media. The exact number of such military vehicles arriving in Ukraine is unknown, but the 50-second video shows at least 8 British armored vehicles with Ukrainian flags flying on turrets. When Britain announced that it would supply the Challenger 2 tanks to Ukraine, it mentioned that 14 main battle tanks would be supplied in the first batch. The tanks are currently being tested at one of the training grounds in western Ukraine. The video, shared by Ukrainian Defense Minister Alexei Reznikov, was recorded in this test area. Ukrainian forces are working on this test site, possibly in combination with other military equipment. They have to provide protection to British tanks during their combat use. Defense Minister Alexei Reznikov spoke highly of the Challenger 2 main battle tanks. Reznikov stated that the Challenger 2 is more comfortable than a Rolls-Royce despite difficult terrain conditions. Reznikov stated that the name given to the Challenger by the Ukrainian paratroopers is Elephant. The Ukrainian defense minister conveyed his thanks to the British people, as well as Prime Minister Rishi Sunak and Defense Minister Ben Wallace. The UK plans to transfer a total of 28 Challenger 2 tanks to Ukraine, as previously reported. Defense Minister Ben Wallace stated that the Challenger 2 tanks will be delivered to Ukraine by the summer following the transfer of French AMX 10 RC tanks and 32 Leopard 2 tanks from Germany and Poland to Ukrainian forces. British Challenger 2 tanks are the third Western-style tank variant to arrive in Ukraine. A group of Ukrainian soldiers received training from British commanders for the British battleship. During the training, the British commanders could not hide their astonishment at the skills of the Ukrainian soldiers. The British Ministry of Defense stated that Ukrainian soldiers are very eager to defend their homeland and reclaim their lands. The British commanders who attended the trainings hoped that the equipment supplied would be used effectively in the effort for the Ukrainians to repel the Russians. The British commander stated that the Ukrainian soldiers understood the training that took months under normal conditions with the exercises that took place within 1 month. In the footage recorded during the training, it is seen that the Ukrainian soldiers successfully carried out target practice under the command of the British commander, Lieutenant Colonel John Stone from the British Army, who oversees the training program, emphasized that all the needs of the Ukrainian forces in the short and medium term will be met by the UK. Stone pointed out that until the Russian threat is completely eliminated, they can supply the Ukrainian forces with equipment again, and stated that they are ready for any sacrifice to end this war soon. The British Ministry of Defense announced that the Ukrainian army's training to master the Challenger 2, which began in January, has ended. What awaits us on the territory of Ukraine after such a great development? In fact, this is the question we're all wondering when we look at the events that have happened on the front line recently. We can easily speculate on this subject. First of all, it's worth noting that these tanks will directly affect all front lines. While major clashes continue in the eastern Ukraine and Kherson direction, the Ukrainian forces can make moves to open a new front. Thanks to these tanks, the Kiev government sets the liberation of Crimea as the ultimate goal. For this reason, the Ukrainian army may attempt to open a third front from Zaporizhia directly to the south coast. Actually, this is not a new front, but it is a point where progress has not been made for a long time. If the Ukrainian forces advance towards the city of Melitopol from the Zaporizhia direction, the next stop from Melitopol will certainly be the coast of the Azov Sea, south of Melitopol. Russian forces increase their dominance in the Sea of Azov by completely occupying the coastline. However, this situation will come to an end when the Ukrainian forces advance together with the British tanks. After the Ukrainian forces land on the shores of the Sea of Azov, it will be possible to attack Crimea from both the Kherson direction and the Zaporizhia direction. At the same time, the access of the Russian forces in the Russian mainland and eastern Ukraine to Crimea will be restricted. Once the city of Melitopol is back under Ukrainian control, the liberation of Crimea will be a matter of time, and this situation will deal a heavy blow to the invasion campaign of Russian leader Vladimir Putin. In addition to this possibility, we can say that we have a high probability of encountering a great tank war show in the coming days when the fact that the Ukrainian forces have Challenger 2 main battle tanks with an event that has been confirmed with geolocatian images. The other day we witnessed a trainload of Russian T-62 medium tanks heading for Ukraine. In fact, Russia desperately activated the rusty ancient 34 tanks. The T-62 tank entered service in 1961 and is among the most produced and used tanks in the world. However, these tanks were kept in warehouses in remote parts of Russia for a long time. Russian soldiers do not have complete information about tanks that have not been used for a long time. It is not known when these armored vehicles will reach the front lines, but it also seems increasingly likely that they will face modern MBDS, including the British Challenger 2 and German Leopard 2. The British-made Challenger 2 tank is considered the most heavily armored tank in the world. The Challenger 2 models use the same depleted uranium-doped cobalt armor as the Abrams tank. These powerful British tanks have a 120mm squared smoothbore gun 1200 HP Perkins CV-12 engine, a weight of 62.5 tons, a range of 450 kilometers, and a top speed of 59 kilometers. For this reason, the participation of these war gods in the Ukrainian front lines will cause the Russians to face a very big problem. In fact, according to most military experts, NATO-level Western tanks, including the British Challenger 2 main battle tanks, have the power to shorten the duration of this war. Besides, it is a modern weapon that cannot be compared to the T-62s. It has been reported that the first 18 state-of-the-art Leopard 2 is considered the most capable. NBT in service in the world have been delivered to the Ukrainian crew currently training on the platform. Berlin had originally promised 14 MBTs, but has increased the number to 18, with Portugal contributing 3 and Sweden 10 more. This will allow Ukraine to use a full tank battalion of Leopard 2s. German tanks were delivered to Ukrainian personnel at the border at the end of last week. German Defense Minister Boris Pistorius stated that, as promised, our tanks reached our Ukrainian friends on time. Pistorius expressed his confidence that the tanks can make a difference on the front. Poland, the country most eager to send tanks to Ukraine, has supplied Ukraine with a battalion of ex-Leopard 2A4 tank models. While not as advanced as the version of the Leopard 2 shipped from German arsenals, these old Polish tanks are far more capable than the T-62s heading towards the front lines of Russian trains. We also remind you that the United States has committed to sending 31 M1A2 Abrams MBTs that should be operational in Ukraine by the end of this year.